So guys, it is finally time to put my mini liquid cooled system through its paces. Over the last few days, I've been testing and tweaking this system a lot, and yes, we finally got the side panels closed, sort of. Today we'll be taking an in-depth look at the thermal performance of this extremely dense water cooled system and my plans moving forward. Now let's pick up where we left off, the fittings on the GPU. Basically, we couldn't close the side panel because the compression fittings were too wide, and my solution for this was basically just to use bare barb fittings. These are super tight, so I didn't need the collars to go around them either, and even then, it's a really tight fit. The side panel does bulge a little in the middle. So with all of the side panels on and the system all closed up, the next part was getting the system running smoothly, specifically getting the 9900K running without limitations on the Z390i Strix motherboard. Here's a quick look at how the 9900K runs out of the box on this motherboard, basically very restricted. Taking the processor through a quick Blender render, the i9 eventually pulls back down to 3.8 GHz. The Z390i Strix has a very sophisticated BIOS with a ton of different settings, and more often than not, it tries to improve and correct some of the settings that you've enabled. I probably spent about 5 hours tinkering around with this board, so let me summarize that into about 30 seconds and show you guys how to set up a 9900K properly. Firstly, enable the XMP2 profile, then change the short and long power duration limits to their max values, then change the LLC mode to mode 1, the current capability to max, the core current limit to max, and for setting up a manual vCore for the CPU, you'll want to use a negative offset somewhere in the ballpark of -30 mV to -80 mV, basically the largest offset that is stable in an AVX workload like Blender's Cycles Render. I'm using a negative offset of -50 mV, which has the vCore landing at 1.234 volts. Another thing to note is that the adaptive vCore mode on this board doesn't work below 1.25 volts. Even if you set 1.15 volts in BIOS, for example, it'll still correct that to 1.25 volts when it's actually under load. Also, despite specifically selecting a single load line calibration mode, the board will dynamically adjust the amount of LLC depending on the load, for example, between AVX and non-AVX workloads. This is smart in practice and overall a pretty good feature. Providing higher CPU voltage for more demanding AVX workloads means improved stability, but I would prefer if this is something that you could adjust yourself. Alright, now let's dive into the thermals and let's start by looking at the 9900K. And first, I want to briefly show you the difference between the fan speed set to 100% versus 60%. Overall, there's about a 6.5 degree difference here. Both are within a safe range, but the difference in noise performance is pretty much night and day. Above the 1500 RPM mark is where the Noctua NF-A12x25 fans start to get audible, but below that, they are actually super quiet. So for this reason, I will be doing all of the thermal testing moving forward with the radiator fans set to 60%. This is an honest representation of how I intend to use the system for day-to-day use versus just showing you guys thermal tests with the fan set to max RPM, which would be kind of misleading for this build. Now, when we compare these thermal results to the previous cooling setup, in this case with the NZXT Kraken X52 cooler with the same fans, the same speed, and the alleged same vCore, the Kraken AIO setup is actually running about 2.5 degrees cooler. So that's not exactly what we expected, but it's not that significant. It is still within a safe range. Also, the reason I say alleged vCore is because since we are using a different motherboard here between the two tests, 1.23 volts on one board might not equal 1.23 volts on another. Now here is a quick comparison with all of the panels off versus all of the panels on, where we see the CPU warm up by about 5.5 degrees with the case all closed up. Overall, that's not too alarming. I've certainly seen worse, even in larger cases where we might see a 7 degree delta or more. Ideally though, the difference here would be 0. VRM thermals during full load are okay, certainly within a safe range, but definitely nothing super impressive. The VRM heat sinks for this board aren't that great. If I was pushing 5 GHz above 1.3 volts in heavy workloads consistently, then I definitely want some sort of active cooling directly for the VRM. Okay, now let's finally talk about the GPU thermals, and the 2080 Ti does get pretty warm when running at stock and with the fans just set to 1400 RPM. In fact, this is actually really warm warm considering that there's a water block slapped on there, but it's definitely an improvement over the stock air cooler, which was sitting north of 80 degrees C and was also significantly louder. When running the 2080 Ti with an undervolt, we drop a massive 11 degrees C. There is a tiny performance hit here too, since we're dropping from around 1930 MHz to 1860 MHz, but that's certainly nothing that I'm going to notice at 1080p in competitive titles, which is what I'm going to be using this system for. Overclocking for a bit of fun absolutely cooks the 2080 Ti, almost touching 80 degrees C with a water block on. That's definitely not something that I'm going to do. So the undervolt is how I was running this GPU prior to the custom loop, and that's how I intend to run it now. Now, when actually running online games, not just the Heaven 4.0 benchmark, seeing as the 9900K is under more load and throwing more heat out into the loop, this in turn sees the GPU warm up a bit more too. Even with the undervolt on the GPU in a typical game, I'm seeing the GPU sit in the low 60s and the CPU anywhere from the mid 60s to the mid 70s. Again, this was just at 60% fan speed though, so although this is quite warm, remember that this system was running very quietly, which is my main priority. So here's an idea of what the system sounds like at idle, but also at full load. So the pump noise is pretty minimal, and seeing as this build is so quiet at full load, you can actually hear a bit of coil whine coming from the GPU. So in the context of liquid cooling, yes, this PC is definitely running a lot warmer than it would in a better ventilated case with a larger radiator. But in the context of a small form factor PC, a build this small with a 9900K and 2080 Ti being able to safely run this quiet at full load, I'd say things aren't looking that bad. Overall, the custom loop in the Ghost S1 was worth it. Although the CPU thermals aren't that different, the GPU has dropped close to 20 degrees C and noise levels are significantly better too. The 2080 Ti with the stock cooler can get pretty loud, and even when idle, it doesn't go below 40% fan speed. Obviously, with a water block now, that isn't an issue, so this build can now be completely silent when at idle. When gaming now, I can barely hear the system at all. Definitely important when I'm streaming, for example. 60% fan speed basically keeps the system at a low hum, and that's it. Having said that, I am curious to switch the pump block to the more powerful Apogee Drive 2 from Swiftech to see whether the improved flow rate on that pump does improve the thermals. I'm honestly not in too much of a hurry to do that though, as this is easily the best my personal system has ever been running. So if you're planning to do a similar build, it definitely can be done. Just expect warmer than usual temperatures since we are running on a single 240mm radiator in a very compact case. Still, the comments on my last video about the tubes melting and the 9900K throttling to base clock are far from reality. As always guys, if you are interested in any of the parts included in this build, you can find them linked down below in the description. So a huge thanks for watching, subscribe down below if you haven't already, and I will see you all in the next one.